Again, so we've just finished the Six Nations tournament and how brilliant a tournament it was. And the takeaway from that is not how good is the Six Nations. Let's preserve what's great about that. No, the takeaway from that is, oh, that competition was good. Let's have another competition. We're back here, and what's been proposed, as reported by the Telegraph, which apparently is going to be signed off before the Rugby World Cup in France this year, is a World League, which will take place over a 2-year period. So twice in every World Cup cycle, there will be a North versus South champion being crowned. And I'm interested to know what you think about this. What is your gut feeling? What's your instant reaction? Before we get into it, just tell me your sort of headline thoughts and get stuck into it in the comments, because I'm very mixed on this, and I'll get into it. But thank you for watching. Hit subscribe, leave your comments. I'm Tim, this is Egg Chasers, and let's get into this. What has been suggested then? Well, according to the Telegraph, like I say, no confirmation yet from World Rugby or from Six Nations or from Sanzar and all the rest of it. However, what's been suggested is that there's going to take place the Six Nations sides and the Rugby Championship sides, plus Fiji and Japan, most likely, will take part in a 2-yearly competition, which will be marketed as a North versus South kind of competition. That means the Six Nations will be ring-fenced. South Africa cannot join the Six Nations. That's a plus point already in my book. But Georgia, you can do one, which bit of a negative point in my book. So the way this will be structured is that in the summer, the Northern Hemisphere sides will go and play against 3 Southern Hemisphere teams. And then in the autumn, the reverse happens. The Southern Hemisphere teams come and play 3 sides in the Six Nations, of the Six Nations sides. And in the second year, you play the other 6, either home or away, so that you play every team once every 2 years. Okay, grand final between the top team in each pool, the best of the North, the best of the South. And there we go. So there's a possible promotion and relegation in the future from 2030, which would be good news for the likes of Georgia, Tonga, Samoa. But all they say is there could be promotion and relegation. I'll believe it when I see it. Well, we've heard too many things like this in the past. So I'm just going to assume that that is not going to happen. Because we've seen in other competitions and with the Six Nations and stuff that there's no appetite for that. But we will see. And turkeys don't tend to vote for Christmas, and that's what it would amount to. Anyway, here's one. The stakeholders, I think I moved on to this. The stakeholders say it will not diminish the status of the Rugby World Cup. Okay. And that it's going to be marketed as the Battle of the Hemispheres. And in British and Irish Lions years, then you can go back to normal tours and tier 2 fixtures, and they kind of don't make a lot of sense there. They don't say what happens to the tournament in those Lions years, but I guess they'll figure that out in the future. So that's the headlines. What is the motivation behind this? My gut feeling, cash. And look, I am sympathetic to that because rugby's not in a great place. You know, I work in the Gallagher Premiership in England, and I live in England. I follow domestic English rugby, and that's in a pretty dire situation with 2 clubs having to quit the league for lack of funds and insolvency this year. Welsh regions are in a pretty dire straits, and there's a lot of issues. So I get the money is important. However, the one thing that's never thought of when it comes to just pure cash is that, well, firstly, there's a phrase I use a lot, which is sometimes people know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And I think in this case, it's important to remember that scarcity has a value. There's a reason people pay so much for diamonds and for gold and silver. It's because there's not very much of it. And in a sporting context, the NFL is an amazing example of that. Some teams, you know, they'll play 17 games a year. Formula One doesn't go round the whole calendar. I'm sure they could make that a year-round, every weekend event if they just wanted cash. However, would they actually get more cash if they did it every single weekend? Or is there something a bit special about it because it doesn't happen very often? So I'm sympathetic to the cash argument and wanting to get the money. And I think the positive of it is, yes, it would be easier to market to non-rugby fans, to casual rugby fans. It creates a sense of meaning, and there's a pool system which is easy to understand, and there's a trophy which people like to see. I get all that, and that makes sense. I can see it. However, I have some massive reservations about this, and as much as the stakeholders say it will not diminish the status of the Rugby World Cup, of course this will diminish the status of the Rugby World Cup. How can it not? You're going to have an effectively a kind of worldwide competition trophy dished out every 2 years. How can that not diminish the status of the Rugby World Cup? I don't buy it. And these people that are saying, oh no, the stakeholders said it won't, are the stakeholders that are going to be benefiting from all this cash, private equity money. And in addition to that, I'm not only certain it's going to diminish the status of the Rugby World Cup, I'm pretty sure it's going to diminish the status of the Six Nations tournament as well. Because at the very same time between January, February, March, every year, you're going to have this Six Nations table. Already going on is going to be another table involving the Six Nations where they're all being ranked 1 to 6 in their North v South competition pool as well. So I think it's going to diminish the status of the Six Nations. And again, your casual rugby fan, which is who I think this is kind of aimed at, there's an argument that they're going to be confused. It's like, oh, sorry, I thought England were top of the pool. Why are you telling me they're fifth? Oh no, that's a different tournament. This is the Six Nations where they play each other. That's one where they compete against each other, but they play against teams from the Southern Hemisphere. You see how it suddenly gets a bit muddier and a bit murkier, and it just feels like this is a short-term cash grab. Whilst I do understand rugby needs money, and I do understand it needs ways to reach out to casual rugby fans. So I'm not totally against it. Also, tier 2 teams. Weren't we told only recently, like after the last World Cup, right, World Rugby came in and said, right, it's really important we develop these tier 2 nations, so we're going to have more fixtures between tier 1 and tier 2 teams. Well, that's just gone out the window. Oh, tier 2 teams, you do your own thing, and then once every 4 years when the Lions is on and we haven't really worked out what's going on, then you're allowed to play the big boys. This should absolutely, if they wanted to do this, and they really were interested in the future of rugby and not just cash, that this would come with promotion and relegation baked in. So that England or Wales, Ireland, France, any of the big teams risk dropping down into the league below. Then there's an element of jeopardy involved. Then you might get me interested. Then it feels like it's actually about growing the game. And if Georgia invest time and effort and money and resources into rugby, which develops the global game overall, you could have a seat at the top table. The fact that they don't says to me this is number one, cash, rugby second. And it just feels like you're trying to squeeze more juice out of the same lemon rather than addressing some of the fundamental issues that rugby has. One of the fundamental issues rugby has is there's too much rugby. We hear all this talk about player safety, player welfare, and what's happening in England, and according to World Rugby, is all of us at amateur levels are going to have to play a different sport to the professional levels, and that's because of some thought about legal lawsuits about brain injury to former professional players. Well, the professional players' game isn't changing, and the professional players aren't playing fewer games. The professional players are getting, another trophy put on their menu. It's like, it's disingenuous the way that it's about player welfare, and then right, we need a bit more out of these players, squeeze that lemon a bit harder. That's what I dislike about this. And for example, the French top 14, which is a brilliant domestic competition, goes on till basically June. I wouldn't be surprised if France end up sending basically a B team down to the Southern Hemisphere to play these nations in this new competition, which will undermine what the people organising it were going for. Or else these players are going to be asked to just, right, yeah, you've just finished a massively long, gruelling season, which got broken up by the Six Nations in the middle of it. Now we want you to go and play some really massive matches. Go on, get on your way. And by the way, you're not just going to New Zealand and basing yourself in one country for a month. you're going to be going to Japan, then Argentina, then New Zealand, and then you can go back to France and start your pre-season for the new season. It's yeah, I think there's as many problems which are a consequence of this, and they and the organisers of it are trying to solve issues on their bottom line of their bank account. So, all right, being proactive then, how do you get more money for rugby? Well, I'll tell you what, you don't diminish, because this will diminish the status of the Rugby World Cup. And again, I understand it, and I'm not totally against it. It just needs to be joined up, and I need to be convinced it's about improving rugby rather than just getting the cash in. If you want to solve some of these issues, get more money, grow the sport, make it more attractive, then I think you focus on the Rugby World Cup and you don't take a short-term view. You don't think about where your money's coming from in the next couple of years. Think 10 years ahead. Think USA 2031. Massive country. What you need to get in 8 years' time, or maybe 12 years' time if you want a longer time horizon, you need to be arriving at a Rugby World Cup with 10 teams, maybe more, 12, 16 teams that could legitimately win the Rugby World Cup, which sounds bonkers right now. There's no chance that we're anywhere near that going into the Rugby World Cup later this year. But that should be the aim rugby has. And if rugby took that as the starting point, we want to have Rugby World Cups where any of the teams could conceivably win the tournament. Then you start making decisions which are going to do things which makes the sport a much greater spectacle. And you don't ostracize tier 2 nations. You actually get them in the fold even more. You give them the ambition and the access to the top table, not shut the trapdoor and share what spoils you can find out between you. That's where I would focus. Not creating a new competition, but trying to make the absolute most out of the competition that you have. Recognizing that scarcity is valuable, and once every 4 years, this should be the biggest event. I mean, it's never going to rival the Football World Cup, but outside of the Football World Cup, the Rugby World Cup could be, and the Olympics, obviously, rugby should be thinking this is going to be the biggest sporting event that comes around once every 4 years. And it could be the biggest sporting event because it comes around once every 4 years. It just feels like there's short-term thinking or not complete all-round thinking. And that's where I'm at on the matter. I'm not totally against the idea. And I'd love to solve the issue of a global season. And in some respects, this kind of, well, no, does it? No, it doesn't. You've still got one team finishing their season, one team starting their season. Anyway, the one thing I'm going to miss is a tour, a 3-match tour. That Ireland versus New Zealand tour was brilliant. New Zealand won the first test, and there was that storyline of what are Ireland made of. They went through and won the series 2-1, and that made for a compelling few weeks. I understand that this new competition may bring about stories that you can latch onto that make it quite interesting, and I can see the merit in some respects. Overall, not convinced is how I think I'd summarise it. But anyway, I've gone on and I've just splurged my thoughts in hopefully some order, probably in no particular order. But if you're still watching, I'm sure you've got some thoughts of your own. So share them in the comments and hit subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video.